The sound of crystals shattering against the library wall echoed through the Kensington mansion. However, the glass did not break by accident. My stepmother, Victoria, had thrown a heavy whiskey tumbler past my head to silence me. I stood frozen in the center of the mahogany-paneled room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the suffocating perfume of old money. My hands trembled by my sides. Victoria stood behind the massive oak desk that had belonged to my father only yesterday. She looked at me with eyes cold enough to freeze the humid Charleston air. She smoothed her black designer dress and smiled a cruel, thin-lipped smile. Beside her, my half-brother Bryce and half-sister Morgan tried to suppress their giggles. They looked at me like I was a cockroach that had somehow survived the exterminator. The family lawyer, Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat nervously. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the leather-bound document in his shaking hands. He announced that he would read the final item of the last will and testament of Preston Kensington III. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. I did not expect the estate. I did not expect the yacht docked in the harbor. I did not even expect the summer home in the Hamptons. I only wanted enough to pay for my nursing degree and a small apology for 20 years of neglect. Mr. Henderson read the final clause in a monotone voice. He stated that, to his illegitimate daughter, Eliza Vance, Preston Kensington left a single item of personal property. Bryce burst into loud laughter. Morgan covered her mouth to hide a smirk. Mr. Henderson pointed to the corner of the room. Resting against the wall was a canvas covered in a dusty gray sheet. Victoria signaled for the butler to unveil it. The sheet slid to the floor. I stared in horror. It was the painting. It was a grotesque, amateurish portrait my father had attempted to paint during his brief and failed artistic phase in the 90s. The colors were muddy. The proportions were wrong. The face looked more like a melting candle than a human being. Victoria walked around the desk and kicked the frame of the painting with her sharp heel. She told me to take my inheritance and leave her property immediately. She declared that I had 5 minutes to vacate the premises before she called the police to remove a trespasser. She reminded me that I was no longer a Kensington servant. And I was certainly not a Kensington daughter. I looked at the lawyer for help. He simply closed his briefcase and looked away. The betrayal stung worse than a physical slap. I walked over to the ugly painting. It was heavy. It was worthless. It was the final joke of a father who had been too weak to love me in public. I lifted the canvas. I turned to look at them one last time. Bryce mocked me by asking if I planned to sell it to a blind man for $5. I did not answer. I gripped the rough wood of the frame until my knuckles turned white. I turned my back on the only home I had ever known and walked out into the pouring rain. However, I did not know that I was carrying a bomb that would soon destroy their entire world. The rain soaked through my thin coat as I dragged the painting down King Street. I found a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city and used my last $60 to pay for a room. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and bleach. I leaned the ugly painting against the peeling wallpaper and collapsed onto the bed. My life had always been defined by what I was not. I was not legitimate. I was not wealthy. I was not welcome. My mother had been a brief affair, a scandal that Preston Kensington had paid to silence. When she died in a car accident when I was 6, my father had taken me in. However, he did not take me in as a daughter. He brought me into the mansion as a charity case. Victoria had ensured that everyone knew my place. I grew up in the servants' quarters. I wore Morgan's hand-me-down clothes that were 2 sizes too big. While Bryce and Morgan attended private academies and debutante balls, I scrubbed the marble floors and polished the silver. Yet I had one secret. In the final 3 years of his life, my father's mind began to fade. Dementia slowly stole his memories and his arrogance. Victoria and the children stopped visiting his room because they could not stand the smell of sickness. They left him to rot in the West Wing. I was the one who fed him. I was the one who read to him. I was the one who held his hand when he forgot his own name. During those long nights, he would talk about his regrets. He would talk about art. He would talk about a specific painting he had bought in Europe 40 years ago, before Victoria, before the greed. He called it his only honest purchase. I always assumed he was hallucinating. One night, 2 weeks before he died, he forced me to drag this hideous self-portrait out of the attic. His hands were shaking violently as he made me promise him something. He begged me to keep this painting. He made me swear on my mother's grave that I would never sell it without looking at it closely. He whispered that the truth was often hidden beneath the surface of ugly things. I thought he was delirious. I thought he was just clinging to his failed artistic dreams, so I promised him just to calm him down. Now, sitting in this dirty motel room, I stared at the melting face on the canvas. I felt a surge of anger. He had promised to take care of me. He had promised to make it right. Instead, he left me this trash and left Victoria everything. I stood up and grabbed a glass of water from the nightstand. I was so angry that I wanted to destroy it. I wanted to punch a hole right through the canvas. I grabbed the painting and threw it onto the bed. I pulled a small pocket knife from my bag. I intended to cut the canvas out of the frame and burn it in the parking lot. I jammed the tip of the knife into the corner of the painting. However, the blade did not slice through easily. It hit something hard. It snagged on a layer that felt different from the brittle old canvas. I frowned. I pulled the knife back and used my fingernail to scratch at the tear I had made. The paint chipped away. But underneath the gray and brown smear of my father's terrible art, there was a flash of brilliant, swirling blue. My heart stopped. I brought the bedside lamp closer. I carefully peeled back another flake of the top layer. The color underneath was vibrant. It was textured. It was alive. I realized with a jolt of electricity that my father had not painted this canvas. He had painted over something else. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. I remembered his whisper. The truth is hidden beneath the surface. I worked through the night. I used nail polish remover and cotton swabs to gently dissolve the top layer of cheap acrylic paint. Slowly, the face of the melting man disappeared. In its place, a landscape began to emerge. It was a night sky filled with swirling stars and a glowing crescent moon. It was a cypress tree reaching up like a dark flame. I covered my mouth to stifle a scream. I had studied art history in the library when Victoria wasn't looking. I knew these brushstrokes. I knew this texture. This was not a copy. This was a lost masterpiece from the 19th century. My father had hidden a Vincent van Gogh painting worth over $100 million underneath a layer of garbage. But that was not the only thing he hid. As I cleared the final corner of the frame, a thick envelope taped to the back of the original canvas fell onto the bedspread. It was sealed with red wax. On the front, in my father's shaky handwriting, were 3 words. The real will. I tore open the envelope. Inside was a legal document, notarized and dated just 3 days before his death. It explicitly stated that the person who possessed this painting and had the patience to restore it was the sole beneficiary of the entire Kensington fortune. It declared all previous wills null and void due to duress and manipulation by Victoria Kensington. I sat on the cheap motel bed with $100 million in art on my lap and the key to an empire in my hand. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sun was beginning to rise over Charleston. A cold, dangerous smile spread across my face. Victoria thought she had thrown out the trash. She had no idea she had just handed me the executioner's axe. I did not run to the police station immediately. I knew that Victoria controlled the local precinct with her checkbook. If I walked in there with a priceless painting and a new will, the evidence would likely disappear within the hour. Therefore, I needed armor before I walked into battle. I wrapped the painting in a heavy blanket and drove my rusted sedan to the University of Charleston. I needed to find Dr. Alan Thorne. He was an art historian who had been banned from the Kensington mansion years ago because he refused to authenticate a fake sculpture for Victoria. I found him in his dusty office in the basement of the history department. He looked at me with suspicion when I entered. However, his expression changed when I unwrapped the canvas on his desk. He gasped. He pulled out a magnifying glass and inspected the brushstrokes in complete silence for 20 minutes. I waited with bated breath. Finally, he looked up with tears in his eyes. He confirmed that it was undoubtedly a genuine Van Gogh from the Arles period. He estimated its conservative value at $150 million. Then, he asked me what I intended to do with such a dangerous object. I told him that I intended to use it to buy my life back. Armed with his written authentication, I made my second stop. I walked into the glass skyscraper of Sterling and Associates. James Sterling was the most ruthless corporate attorney in the state. More importantly, he was the only lawyer who had ever sued the Kensington family and won. I did not have an appointment. However, when I told the receptionist that I had Preston Kensington's real will, James Sterling came out to the lobby himself. We sat in his corner office overlooking the harbor. He read the document twice. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He told me that this document was ironclad. He explained that by concealing the existence of this will, Victoria and her lawyer had committed felony fraud. He reached for his phone to call the authorities. But I stopped him. I told him that I did not just want them arrested. I wanted them exposed. I wanted them to feel the same humiliation they had inflicted on me for 20 years. James Sterling put down the phone and asked me what I had in mind. I pulled up an Instagram post on my phone. It was a photo posted by my half-sister, Morgan, just an hour ago. The caption announced the Grand Kensington estate auction taking place this Saturday night. Victoria was moving fast. She planned to liquidate the entire estate, sell the mansion, and move the money to offshore accounts before anyone could ask questions. The auction was going to be the social event of the season. Every wealthy investor, art collector, and politician in South Carolina would be there. It was the perfect stage. I told James Sterling that we would not file the papers today. We would wait 48 hours. We would let Victoria believe she had won. We would let her stand on that stage and sell assets that she did not own. Then, at the moment of her greatest triumph, we would strike. James Sterling looked at me with a newfound respect. He agreed to the plan. He promised to have a team of federal marshals waiting in the wings. I left his office and walked to a high-end boutique on King Street. I used the emergency credit card my father had hidden in the painting's frame along with the will. I bought a dress. It was not a servant's uniform. It was a gown of midnight blue silk that matched the sky in the Van Gogh painting. I booked a suite at the Ritz-Carlton under a fake name. For the next 2 days, I watched the Kensington family on social media. They were celebrating. Bryce posted videos of himself drinking champagne on the yacht. Morgan posted selfies with the jewelry she planned to keep. Victoria gave interviews to local news stations about her heavy heart and the burden of managing the estate. They had no idea that the ghost of the girl they kicked out was watching every move. Saturday evening arrived. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the hotel suite. I applied dark red lipstick. My hands were steady. My fear was gone, replaced by a cold, burning determination. My phone buzzed with a text from James Sterling. It read that the trap was set and the marshals were in position. I grabbed my clutch bag, which contained a photocopy of the will. I walked out of the hotel and stepped into the waiting limousine. The destination was my childhood home. However, tonight, I was not going to the back door. I was going to the front entrance to take back what was mine. The Kensington ballroom glittered with the flash of cameras and the sparkle of diamonds. I stood at the back of the room and watched the spectacle. Victoria stood on the raised stage like a queen addressing her subjects. She held a crystal gavel in her manicured hand. Behind her, a large screen displayed the current item up for bid. It was the Kensington mansion itself. The auctioneer announced the current bid at $12 million. My half-brother Bryce stood in the front row and toasted with a glass of champagne. He was already celebrating the money he had not yet earned. Victoria raised the microphone to her lips. She thanked the crowd for their generosity during this difficult time. She lied about how much her late husband would have wanted this sale. However, her performance was about to end. I nodded to James Sterling, who stood near the audio control booth. Then, I pushed open the velvet ropes and stepped onto the red carpet of the center aisle. My heels clicked rhythmically against the marble floor. The sound cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Heads turned. Gasps rippled through the room. They did not recognize the girl in the midnight blue silk gown. They only saw a woman of power walking with a dangerous purpose. Victoria squinted against the stage lights. Suddenly, her face went pale. She recognized me. She dropped the gavel. It clattered loudly against the podium, sending a screech of feedback through the speakers. She screamed for security to remove me immediately. She pointed a shaking finger and called me a trespasser. 2 large security guards stepped forward to intercept me. But James Sterling stepped out of the shadows. He held up a federal court order with a gold seal. He warned the guards that touching me would result in immediate arrest for assaulting a federal witness. The guards froze. I walked past them and climbed the stairs to the stage. I stood toe-to-toe with my stepmother. The room was silent enough to hear a pin drop. Victoria hissed that I was making a fool of myself. She demanded to know why I had returned with my trash. I smiled. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a flash drive. I plugged it into the podium's laptop. The image of the mansion on the giant screen behind us disappeared. Instantly, it was replaced by a high-resolution photograph of the restored painting. The starry night sky swirled in brilliant blues and golds. The crowd gasped in unison. An art critic in the front row stood up and shouted that it was a Van Gogh. Victoria looked at the screen and then back at me with confusion. I leaned into the microphone. My voice boomed across the ballroom. I announced that the trash she had thrown at me was actually Night Over the Rhone, a lost masterpiece hidden by my father. I declared that its value was appraised at $150 million this morning. A shockwave went through the audience. Bryce dropped his champagne glass. Morgan looked like she was going to faint. Victoria shook her head violently. She stammered that the painting still belonged to the estate. She claimed that since I found it in her house, the money was hers. She reached for the microphone to reclaim control. But I was not finished. I told her that the painting was just the container. I pressed the next button on the laptop. The screen changed again. This time, it displayed the scanned document of the real will. I read the highlighted text aloud for the entire room to hear. I stated that Preston Kensington left 100% of his assets to the person who possessed the painting. I stated that the document explicitly disinherited Victoria, Bryce, and Morgan due to moral bankruptcy. I looked Victoria dead in the eye. I told her that she was currently standing in my house. I told her that she was trying to sell my property. I told her that the auction was over. Suddenly, the side doors of the ballroom burst open. A team of federal marshals marched in. They were not there for me. They headed straight for the stage. The lead marshal climbed the steps and pulled out a pair of metal handcuffs. He informed Victoria that she was under arrest for estate fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. The crowd erupted into chaos. Flashes from cameras blinded us as the press rushed forward to capture the downfall of the Kensington Queen. Victoria screamed. She lunged at me with her claws out like a desperate animal. However, the marshal tackled her before she could touch me. He slammed her against the podium. He clicked the cuffs onto her wrist. I stood still in the center of the storm. I watched as the woman who had tormented me for 20 years was dragged down the stairs in her designer dress. She looked back at me with eyes full of hatred and fear. I did not look away. I simply raised my hand and gave her a small, polite wave goodbye. The auctioneer banged his gavel one last time. He announced that the Kensington estate was no longer for sale. It had just been reclaimed by its rightful owner. The police sirens faded into the distance. The ballroom was finally empty of guests and paparazzi. Only the hired staff and my two half-siblings remained in the wreckage of the party. Bryce and Morgan stood by the abandoned buffet table. They looked like stranded tourists who had lost their passports. Their arrogance had vanished along with their mother. I walked down the steps of the stage. My heels clicked on the marble floor with a sound that made them flinch. I stopped 3 feet away from them. I waited. Bryce was the first to break. He stepped forward with a pathetic, trembling smile plastered on his face. He called me sister for the first time in 20 years. He tried to touch my arm. However, I stepped back as if he were contagious. He stammered that they were victims too. He claimed that Victoria had manipulated them and that they had always secretly liked me. He asked if we could start over as a real family. Morgan nodded aggressively. She wiped her mascara-stained tears and added that they were blood relatives. She insisted that Dad would not have wanted them to be homeless. I laughed. It was a cold, dry sound that echoed in the empty hall. I looked at Bryce. I reminded him of the day he laughed when I asked for money to buy textbooks. I looked at Morgan. I reminded her of the time she accused me of stealing a ring to get me fired. I told them that they were right about one thing. Dad did not want them to be homeless. He wanted them to be independent. I pulled 2 envelopes from my clutch bag. I handed one to Bryce and one to Morgan. Their eyes lit up with hope. They tore open the envelopes expecting checks or cash. However, their faces fell. Inside each envelope was a single, one-way bus ticket to a small town in North Dakota. I told them that our father had owned a small, failing gas station there. I informed them that I had decided not to sell it. I told them that the gas station needed 2 attendants to pump gas and scrub toilets. It was the only job offer they were going to get. Bryce crumpled the ticket and threw it on the floor. He shouted that he would sue me. He screamed that he would never work a blue-collar job. I signaled to the head of security. 2 guards stepped forward. I gave my first order as the mistress of the house. I told the guards to escort the trespassers off the property immediately. I clarified that they were to leave with nothing but the clothes on their backs. No cars. No jewelry. No phones bought with estate money. Morgan tried to run up the stairs to her room to grab her designer bags, but a guard blocked her path. He firmly guided her toward the front door. I watched through the window as they were shoved out onto the wet pavement. It was raining again. They stood at the gate, shivering and screaming at the closed iron bars. Finally, they realized no one was listening. They began to walk into the dark night. I turned away from the window. The house was quiet. For the first time in my life, the air in the mansion did not smell of oppression. It smelled of freedom. The next morning, I met with James Sterling in the library. We went over the legal destruction of Victoria's legacy. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The forged documents, the offshore accounts, and the hidden will ensured she would not see daylight for at least 15 years. James asked me what I wanted to do with the mansion. He assumed I would move into the master bedroom. However, I shook my head. I looked at the portrait of my father that hung over the fireplace. I told James that this house had too many ghosts. I did not want to live in a museum of my own trauma. I told him to prepare the paperwork for a transfer of deed. I had a different purpose for the Kensington estate. I was going to turn it into something beautiful. I was going to turn it into a sanctuary for artists who had been rejected by the world, just like my father. And just like me, 6 months have passed since the night of the auction. I stood on the balcony of the former Kensington mansion. The sun was setting over the harbor. However, the silence that used to haunt this estate was gone. Below me, the gardens were filled with the sound of violins tuning and children laughing. I did not keep the house for myself. I transformed the cold mausoleum into the Vance Academy for the Arts. It was now a full scholarship boarding school for underprivileged children who had talent but no money. I walked through the hallways where I used to scrub floors on my hands and knees. Now, those walls were covered in colorful murals painted by my students. I stopped in the main lobby. In the center of the room, inside a bulletproof glass case, stood a painting. But it was not the Van Gogh. I had sold The Night Over the Rhone to the Museum of Modern Art for $140 million. That money was now a permanent endowment that would keep this school running for a century. The painting in the glass case was the ugly, melting portrait my father had painted. I had kept the original canvas frame and a high-resolution print of the ugly layer before I restored it. I placed a plaque beneath it with a simple inscription. It read, "Look deeper." It served as a daily reminder to every student that value is not always visible on the surface. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a notification from the prison service. Today was visitation day at the Federal Correctional Institution in Tallahassee. I did not go to visit. However, I received a report from the warden. Victoria was adjusting poorly to her new life. The woman who once threw crystal glasses at servants was now scrubbing the cafeteria floors for 12 cents an hour. The irony was not lost on me. I also received a letter from North Dakota yesterday. It was written on a greasy napkin. Bryce wrote that he and Morgan were freezing in the winter snow. He complained that pumping gas was ruining his hands. He begged me to send them $500 for a heater. I tossed the napkin into the fireplace. I watched the flames consume their complaints. They were finally learning the one lesson Victoria had failed to teach them. They were learning the value of earning their own survival. I walked out into the garden to join the opening ceremony of the new semester. A little girl named Maya ran up to me. She was wearing a dress that was too big for her, just like I used to wear. She held up a drawing she had made. It was a sketch of me standing on the stage at the auction. She looked at me with wide, fearful eyes. She asked if she could really stay here. She whispered that her stepmother told her she was worthless. I knelt down in the grass. I took her small hands in mine. I looked her in the eye and spoke with the voice of a woman who had won her war. I told her that she was not worthless. I told her that she was a masterpiece waiting to be revealed. I stood up and looked at the empire I had built from the ashes of my trauma. My father had left me a hidden fortune, but the real inheritance was not the money or the Van Gogh. The real inheritance was the resilience to scrape away the ugly layers of my life to find the beauty underneath. The world had tried to paint over me. They tried to cover me in gray and brown. But they failed. I smiled as the orchestra began to play a symphony of triumph. I was no longer the illegitimate daughter. I was the artist of my own destiny. And finally, the picture was perfect.